Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about the numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I maintain the California Highways webpage.
I'm Tom Fear. I'm one of 4 admins on the Gribble Nation road page.
This is episode 1.05, Building a State Highway System, the Great Renumbering, and New Freeway.
Last time on California Highways Route by Route, we saw multiple surveys indicating the need for interregional interstate highways, increased federal interest in interregional highways, increased federal funding for interregional highways, passage of the Collier-Burns legislation establishing a state highway fund and use of the gas tax for funding, passage of the Interstate Highway Acts, establishment of the Freeway and Expressway system, major highway definitions to accommodate the growth of the freeway system, continue construction of expressways and the freeways.
The late 1950s were really a busy time. In this episode, we see the system transformed into today's system. We see a massive highway renumbering in the state. We see adjustments in the routes and the numbering. We see the beginning of the Freeway Revolts. We see the budget cuts that occur under the Reagan and the first Jerry Brown administrations, or at least we head into them. And we see the passage of the Environmental Quality Act.
As the 1960s start, California has a large system of state highways. Multiple numbers refer to the same highways. You have the legislative route numbers and the signed state route numbers. In addition, you have things like the U.S. routes in the interstates. The same number often refers to different highways. So, for example, you have duplication with some of the U.S. routes with US 80 and Interstate 80. Long multiplex co-signage for routes that is increasingly meaningless. Increasing push to retire older numbers bypassed by the interstates.
The 1960s also saw significant construction in the routes, and there was really one key person behind this, Edmund G. Pat Brown, the governor from 1959 to 1967. The younger folks will know Jerry Brown, his son. He continued the legacy of Earl Warren, who later went on to the Supreme Court, who gave California the Collier-Burns Act. Under Pat Brown, there was significant expansion of the freeway system. The State Water Project was launched. There were several new university and state college campuses. He really expanded UC at the time. He spent upwards of a fifth of the California budget on basic infrastructure. During his tenure in the 1960s, he made California a national leader in expanding transportation infrastructure. And between 1956 and 1972, the number of miles in the state highway system increased by 28%. There was also one additional reason for all of the construction. Well, actually, 2. Remember the 1959 Act that created the Freeway and Expressway system? It said it is the purpose of the legislature in extending lengths of routes presently in the state highway system and in adding routes to the state highway system in this act that additional mileage be incorporated into the state highway system in order that said mileage may become part of the California Freeway and Expressway system. So far, so good. But it also said there shall be no expenditures made on the extensions of the state highways added by this act or on any state highways added by this act other than the planning, design, maintenance, right-of-way, acquisition, and right-of-way clearance until after the 1963-64 fiscal year. In other words, they had to wait until the end of 1963 to start the actual construction on roads. Then there was a big push to get all the highways done because they had federal funding that would expire. And so it was use it or lose it, get those interstates built.
The Great Renumbering, or as I like to call it, the 1964 State Highway Renumbering. Senate Bill 64 of 1964 reorganized the state highways effective July 1st. Some keynotes. The highway system is simplified and clarified. The legislative route numbers are replaced with the signed state route numbers. Basically, this is just one system of numbering instead of 2. Former signed route numbers that conflicted with the interstates are renumbered. So, for example, you had like California State Route 5, which is on Skyline Boulevard near the Bay Area, was conflicting with Interstate 5, so that was renumbered to California State Route 35. Signs are placed on highways to designate only one route number wherever feasible. This is still true today. Each route has only one official number. Numbers are not duplicated within the state, although there are loopholes and many unbuilt gaps. A very famous loophole for a duplication of a number would be Interstate 80 Business in Sacramento, which is legislatively designated as California State Route 51. In the run-up to the renumbering, a lot of the U.S. routes were truncated out of California by AASHTO definition. They remained signed on interstates until they were substantially completed. A good example of this would be U.S. Route 40 was signed on pretty much all of I-80 until the freeway or the interstate was completed in the state. Co-signing is only be for relatively short distances, meaning that multiplexes are only supposed to be for a short distance.
There are a number of good examples of renumbering. Tom already mentioned one of them. So both LRN 60 and LRN 56, which were signed as State Route 1, became combined and put into the legislative code as Route 1. Okay, you had LRN 286, 12, and 27, which were signed as US 80, became I-8, and that then freed up the Route 80 to become Interstate 80. State signed Route 8, which was LRN 5, because of I-8 being created, became Route 26. And another portion of it, the LRN 34 portion, became Route 88. So they were effectively simplifying the numbers. And then with all of that, a whole batch of LRNs, 68, 14, 69, 6, 3, 242, 17, 37, and 30, all became I-80. But as Tom noted, it became signed as I-80 once US 40 was completed. Tom also gave a good example of Business Route 80, which at times has been emphasized as Business Route 80, at times it hasn't. That sort of came in a bit later with plans they had in the Sacramento area, and we'll cover that when we talk about Route 80. But if you still look at the post miles, the segment from US 50 all the way up going north to I-80, the post miles say Route 51, which is really the route number. And these numberings reflected both anticipated and requested interstate highways and planned routings. The San Francisco freeway numberings, the downtown LA interstates, those all got numbers that were then later changed.
Probably my favorite that I kind of find the most interesting is I-5 West. Was one of the casualties of the 1964 renumbering. There was a suffixed west and east route of Interstate 5. The western route went through the Bay Area, through Oakland specifically, and the eastern route is what you see north of the Tracy area towards Sacramento. And what's notable about that is it kind of goes back to that there's no duplication of route numbers. So this is where you get like I-580 and I-505 from.
My favorite one is what happened in downtown LA, where they were originally planning to create little stub routes of 105 and 110, and they ended up just extending 101 and doing some rearranging, and we later saw both 105 and 110 numbers being reused.
So the new state highway shield, there's several generations of the state route spade. The 1934 is the classic white bear spade. That was kind of on a porcelain steel background. The 1960 variant is just a plain white spade, which is very similar to the modern iteration, but not quite there yet. And the 1964 shield, which is still in use today, is the green California spade that pretty much everyone who's listened to this podcast is going to be familiar with.
And I'll note that you won't find any bear shields still out in the field, but you still will find an occasional plain white shield in the field. Most notably, the one I see all the time is you're going down the 170 in North Hollywood, and you've got the transition to the eastbound 134, and the big green sign still, to this day, I just drove it last week, has a white shield for 134.
That's the only one I'm aware of that is still on a Caltrans maintained road, or at least the only one I've ever seen.
There used to be one, we did a road geeking trip to Santa Barbara, and there used to be one just before Route 154 came off of Old 101. But I don't think that was there the last time I was by.
Yeah. What's weird is around my area, and this has nothing to do with a Caltrans maintained road because this is all Park Service, but in Yosemite, they actually still use the white shields on their guide signs, which I think is really weird to see. It's the only national park that does it that way for whatever reason in California. 2 bits of reasoning behind the shield change. 1959, the new MUTC requirements required the shield on the sign to match the shield on the road. So the bear in the bear spade was hard to duplicate. during 1964 to distinguish the old route numbers from the new route numbers, and the MUTC meant that they could use the outlines instead of the mounted shields. So basically, you're kind of getting into the variance between what is called a G28-1 and a G28-2 shield. So basically, the G28-1 is a simplified version of the California route spade, which you'll see on guide signs on freeways. Occasionally, you'll see it as a reassurance shield along a highway, but it's meant to be kind of like a simplified version of the normal California State Route Shield, which is the G28-2. And the green highway spade tested way better for visibility in fog and snow. So it's kind of the theory locally here in the Central Valley that is the big reason why US 99 ultimately ended up being decommissioned in California, is because the green spade was kind of like the showcase during Thule fog season.
Never had heard that before. I was going to ask, in other states with the MUTCD requirements, did they change their shields around the same time, or did they just go to the convention of putting the two-letter state abbreviation and the route number? I'm thinking Utah had a beehive on their sign. I think, was it Nebraska has a big orange sheep? Did they just not follow that MUTCD?
A lot of the state route shields around this era did get simplified. Some were faster than others. Florida, for a long time, was a kind of a hang-on as far as having kind of a fairly unique shield design, where it would display like the Florida Keys and have some strange variations where it would show like state secondary and county routes on the same shield. So it wasn't universal, but this is kind of the era when it all kind of dwindles more into towards what you see today. Even the U.S. route spade that is common in other states today really began to emerge during this era.
As Tom noted, in conjunction with renumbering, U.S. highways were being deprecated. Only interstate U.S. highways that weren't duplicated with interstates were retained in California. Only in-state routes over 300 miles were retained, and this led to the truncation or down-signing, shall we say, of numerous routes in California. So US 91 became Route 91. US 99 became California 99. US 299 became California 299. US 60 became Route 60, although the freeway version of it never was planned as US 60. And other truncations led to renumbering. US 399 became part of Route 33. US 466 became part of Route 46, Route 58, I-15. US 101A became California 1, Route 1. There were just a small handful of U.S. routes retained in the state. US 101, US 395, those were all cross-state. US 199, which goes into Oregon. US 97, which goes into Oregon. US 95, which goes into Nevada. And US 6, which of course goes cross-country. And that was truncated to start in Bishop.
So basically, the whole hook with this is, from everything I've looked at historically, it was the opinion of not just the California Highway Commission, but a lot of states, that basically the era of the U.S. routes was coming to an end with the emergence of the interstates. And if you put yourself back in the 1950s and 60s, it's pretty reasonable to see how that probably train of thought would have taken hold. That really hasn't played out in modern times. There is a big part the U.S. route system still plays in the overall national grid, but basically the way it kind of reads is that pretty much a lot of state highway engineers thought the U.S. route system was kind of going to go the way of like the auto trails.
It's certainly true in California that we didn't have a lot of U.S. routes retained. Other states, you look in the South, you look up in the Wisconsin area, the Northeast, and you've still got loads of U.S. routes, although I don't know how many of them are built out as full freeways. I think most of them remain smaller roads.
It depends. I mean, there are some kind of bigger ones like US 27 in Florida, which is like really a good example of kind of like a US 101 type expressway through the center of the state. So there are some good examples where they really became modernized, but for the most part, they're secondary corridors, or basically they're corridors at areas that don't really have freeways in general. During 1965, the system was tweaked. Extensions, segment combinations, and adjustments due to freeway system changes. So some examples would be Route 47 and Route 90. The deletion of segments no longer needed or bypassed, such as Route 245 and 241. Definition of new plan routes or numbers for bypass segments to be retained, such as routes 263, 265, and 267. In particular, with 263 and 265, and as an example, those are former segments of U.S. Route 99.
Another example that was in the list before was Route 47 and Route 90. This is when you had the combinations of the far ends of Imperial Highway and the Marina Freeway segment of Route 90 all coming together. This is when you had adjustments in Route 47 and Route 103 as they were playing around with the freeways in the Long Beach area. Construction continued at this time during the Pat Brown administration. There was strong construction through 1967 and due to fiscal years into 1968. And this is really when we saw the bulk of the freeway system completed. I think they had a mandate to get all the interstates completed by like 1972. So they were really trying to get the bulk of the interstates done, and then they would focus on many of the state highways. But things slowed down after 1968, and there were three main factors. First, this is when we started seeing freeway revolts. Secondly, there was cost. And thirdly, the Environmental Quality Acts came into play.
So freeway revolts, increased construction led to increased oppositions to freeways, such as the San Francisco Freeway Revolt, the Beverly Hills Freeway, and the Pacific Coast Freeway. Wealthy areas had a lot more clout than disadvantaged areas. This led to racial inequities in construction. Some examples would be like Interstate 980 in Oakland and Interstate 5 in the Boyles Heights areas. Revolts continue to play out to present day, which Interstate 710 is probably the prime example of this.
In many ways, it's not only people will think about the gap completion, and that's part of it with South Pasadena and Pasadena fighting it, but you also had a whole batch of disadvantaged areas finally being heard as they talked about addressing the main trucking routes and improving and widening the main section of 710 up to I-10 from the port. And we'll cover all the freeway revolts very much when we talk about those particular routes in the areas. So when we talk about Route 2, we'll talk about the Beverly Hills Freeway, and Route 1, we'll talk about some of the wild ideas they had for the Pacific Coast Freeway. Now is the time in the podcast where we bring in a guest to talk about a subject related to the episode. Today's guest is Arturo Salazar, moderator of the Freeways of Los Angeles Facebook group. He is joining us to talk about the impact of the Brown administration, the Great Renumbering, and the Freeway Revolt. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Okay, well, I'll give a little background and preceding what I do now. My name is Arturo Salazar. I was a transportation engineer for the Caltrans District 7, which is the Los Angeles-based district office, from 1980 until 2017. So that was a 37-year full-time career. The last 5 years, I've worked part-time as what Caltrans, or what the state calls a retired annuitant, as a transportation engineer, the same classification I had for 37 years, but only part-time, and my responsibilities have been reduced, which is the only way I would work in this after full retirement. So what I do now, since 2014, I began a Facebook group called Freeways of Los Angeles, and for the last 3-some years, it's been on Twitter. So similar posts on each of the social media platforms, but the Facebook version has a lot more followers. We have over 11,000, and there's a lot of good conversations and discussion about freeways. Not everyone's crazy about freeways, but we try keeping the discussion civil, and we cover a lot of the history. I have access to a historical vault with Caltrans that I don't know of anyone else that has, but that's because of my many years of working there and the relationships I built up. I have people on the inside that will trust me with this material, and they're glad that it's gotten out in the public forum, the history of our highways here in the Los Angeles area. So that is something, it's a joy for me to do. I'm a student, an amateur student amateur historian of freeway history in the Los Angeles area, and I will continue doing this as long as I have the energy and strength. So that's what I do related to freeways. Of course, I have a lot of other personal things I'm involved with, but that's what's going on with me now.
You're not alone in being an amateur historian. I think both Tom and I are amateur historians. The only professional historian is my daughter, who's working on a PhD in his. I want to say I've been a member of your Facebook group for a long time, and I truly enjoy the pictures you post and the discussions there. I think Tom's also been a member for a long time.
Yes, appreciate your contributions, both of you.
Oh, you're welcome. Definitely appreciate that.
And your Southern California region, or what's the formal name of your webpage?
Well, let's be precise. The Southern California regional page is Mike Ballard. I do the California Highways page, which goes back to '96, and Tom does all the blog posts over on Gribble Nation.
Very good, excellent work. It's very informative and well done. And
from what I understand, I'm a reference at Caltrans.
You are. I could attest to that. I went to your webpage in the past, many years ago, before I knew who you were, and I know others at Caltrans have done the same. So, go ahead.
I capture what I can, and I try and keep it updated. I slug through the CTC minutes and all that other fun stuff.
Okay. Well, we'll always appreciate your contributions to the Freeways of Los Angeles. Tom, I wish you would post more. Sometimes I have to grab and share from something you've shared, but I wish you would just forward it and put it directly on the Freeways of Los Angeles page. It's really good stuff you have there as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Sometimes I just forget. There's like so many that I share, like a lot of the older highway stuff too. Okay. Sometimes I forget. Like I saw the Ridge Route one today from the 1916 California Highway Bulletin. Yes. Saw that popped up on your page.
Right, I shared that. I saw that, and that's good stuff. It's good history. So I hope you don't mind me beating you to it, maybe and sharing it. But that's really, really interesting, good stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
What do you think was unique about freeway construction in California during the Earl Warren and Pat Brown administrations? We're talking up to about 1967.
Well, to me, the obvious thing is that because there was environmental laws had not been enacted, there was a lot more freedom in the project development process, the design process, and California was able to put out a lot of freeways in a short amount of time in the 60s, well, in the late 50s and into the 60s, because we didn't have those constraints. And more recently, in the earthquake that took down the La Cienega Fairfax structure on Route I-10, Santa Monica Freeway, you saw how fast that was rebuilt, and that's because some of the environmental rules were relaxed or expedited or dispensed with. So we were able to design that rather quickly and have it rebuilt rather quickly. So that to me is the greatest thing that stands out about what my predecessors, because I was a freeway designer, so I had to deal with the environmental laws and rules from 1980 on. But before that, I just look back at the amount of design work that was done as well as the construction, and it's just an enormous amount that was done in such a short time. It's such an impressive thing. But of course, some of the safeguards we have now, especially with relocating people, have changed, and I believe for the better. So the public now is more protected. I've got stories I could share about the 555 interchange that I designed, and I used to get calls from people that once they found out the favorable right-of-way relocation benefits we had, people were calling me and asking me, "Can you redesign it? One of the connectors to run right through my property. I want my home to be taken because I'm going to end up with something better under these benefits." I've got stories to tell like that. So that wasn't the case during the Century Freeway construction, because that's when some of these things were put into place with some of the legal rulings as well as the environmental laws.
Yet I remember some pictures during I want to say the 101 construction of their moving and relocating houses at the time. And I want to say the same thing. I want to say the same thing happened in Fresno with the Route 99 construction. I remember a famous picture of they're moving a church.
Yes, that's in the California Highways and Public Works, that one.
But especially in the area where the Arroyo Seco meets the 4-level and south of that, the Harbor Freeway, there was a lot of homes that were saved, and there's in the California Highways and Public Works magazine, they do document some of those. I know in the LA area, but in more recent years that's not the case. Don't see that happening.
I think that I grabbed some of them on the blog I did for the Harbor Freeway. Some of those California Highways Public Works pictures of them moving the houses off the around the Harbor Freeway corridor.
Yeah, especially around the Coliseum area, Santa Barbara Avenue, now 13 Boulevard.
Yeah, it was Santa Barbara Avenue.
Before we go to the next question, you mentioned the rebuilding of the La Cienega, what do they call it? Causeway, I guess it would be. The elevated. the elevated
It's
structure.
Viaduct. It's just an overcrossing.
Yeah, the elevated structure after the '94 earthquake. Do you think one of the reasons they relaxed the environmental restrictions is it was essentially built in the same footprint with essentially the same style, so
Yes.
things didn't change much?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, if we would have rerouted the freeway, maybe went below grade as opposed to above grade, that would have not been so smooth. So yes, for the reasons you gave, that's one of the reasons, some of the main reasons why it was expedited.
Now, I know you weren't working for Caltrans at the time, but do you know what the general philosophy of the Division of Highways at that time was regarding placement and routing of the highways? How did they determine what was the best route from the point A to point B in the legislative definition?
From as best as I could determine, is the state would use would try to parallel or replace main routes or state highway. For example, the Ramona Freeway followed or took over Ramona Boulevard and parts of Garvey Avenue. Not entirely. There were some places where they veer off, but I believe the state used major highways, expressways, and I believe that minimized the amount of right-of-way that had to be acquired for the wider freeways. But I know there's a lot of talk, and there's been some documentation about the state designing the freeways through the more disadvantaged areas, and I believe there is some truth to that, but I don't believe all of it was entirely intentional, that that's what they were targeting. But there were a lot of routes that they did convert to full freeway, just very similar to what they're doing on Route 71 in Pomona. That was an expressway for many years. It's now underway, and I worked on that project before I retired, is converting that to a full freeway. So in that case, that would be the more prudent thing to do as an engineer. That's the least destructive, you might say, or the maybe the best way to design it, because you've already got a clear path that's in place.
I'm familiar with the Route 71 stuff because I'm a member out at what used to be Orange Empire Railway Museum, and we would always cut down the 71 to the 60 as we drove from Northridge out to the museum. Since you mentioned it, I tend to do follow-up questions.
Okay.
Do you think in some cases the routing was chosen based on right-of-way cost, and that had what we see as impact to disadvantaged communities was less, I'm intentionally going after the disadvantaged communities, and more, this is the cheapest right-of-way that we could get?
One thing I didn't add, I want to throw in now, and it partially answers your question, is, and this is something that I learned as a designer at Caltrans, is our freeways are designed 50% by engineers and 50% by politicians. Politicians, it's amazing how much they dictate on the design of freeways. And I can't help but think during the 50s and 60s how much politics came into play in determining the routes that the freeways ended up as. So perhaps there were politicians that wanted to take the path of least resistance, political resistance, and say, let's go through this disadvantaged neighborhood because they don't have the money to challenge us or fight us like Beverly Hills or South Pasadena. So I can't help but think that the politics was the major, had a major voice in the routes that ended up being what we now have as the freeway routes in Los Angeles. So I put a lot more weight on the politics than most people would think.
Other than the two well-known examples you've given, which we'll cover in future podcasts, the Beverly Hills Freeway and the whole 710 kerfuffle, can you think of a good example of some route that people may not think of that was dictated by political constraints?
A route that didn't take place?
No, that had its design changed in interesting ways due to political constraints.
The one example that comes to mind is the San Diego Freeway, I-405, right in the area where the junction with I-10, Santa Monica Freeway. If you're looking at aerial shots of the 405, or actually you're actually looking in a northwesterly direction, and you see when it hits the 10 interchange, it does some curving there, and there's no rhyme or reason why, because other than the politicians wanted to protect some buildings or some businesses that maybe what some of their campaign donators owned, and they injected politics into the decision making, and you see some freeways like that example curving around some places where it didn't make sense. Why didn't it just go straight through? So that one comes to mind right there. And I'm sure if I continue thinking about it, there's other examples. In Orange County, it was interesting when we were widening the I-5 just north of the Route 55 interchange, the Newport Freeway back then, now Coastal Mesa Freeway. We were the alignment of the design of the ramps was definitely affected by politics. We were removing some ramps because they were causing traffic operation problems, weaving issues. So we were going to place ramps in a certain place, and the politicians said, wait a minute, we want there to be a ramp that accesses our Civic Center in Santa Ana, which is on 1st Street, and we had the off-ramp on 4th. So we actually had to add what I call a horseshoe design off of the off-ramp to 4th Street, where literally the off-ramp makes a U-turn over Route 5, and it brings traffic back to 1st Street for the politicians that wanted direct access to the Civic Center on 1st Street in Santa Ana. So that happened in one of my projects, and I believe that happens a lot more often than most people would imagine.
Now, you said you were working on projects in Orange County, but I think you said you were working for District 7. Was there some sort of connection between District 7 and 12?
Orange County was part of District 7 until about 1988, and then it broke off because of politics. At that time, District 12 was formed, and I had the choice of joining the engineers that were moving to District 12, but our understanding was that there was going to be mainly a lot of consultant engineering work, and the designers in District 12 would just simply be doing oversight, babysitting the consultant design. I wanted to do my own hands-on design, so I chose to remain in District 7, which then just included Ventura and Los Angeles County. So in the 80s, most of my design work was in Orange County while it was still part of District 7.
Okay, heard a rumbling of paper there. So back then, as opposed to now, what was the process of building a highway? Now we've got, all the environmental stuff, and we'll talk about that in the next episode, that gets in the way when you're building a highway. Back then, what was the process?
Well, more of the focus was on the traffic demands and the forecasted the traffic projections, or the planners, the traffic planners' crystal ball, you might say. That drove a lot of the decision making in terms of how many lanes on a freeway, on a main line, how many lanes on the ramps, where the ramps go to, and boy, little did the planners of the 1940s and 50s imagine they did not expect the population growth to explode in Southern California. And for example, when the Ramona Freeway was being built through Baldwin Park, West Covina, that's when the original In-N-Out got relocated. And at Citrus and Barranca, which is by the Eastland Shopping Center, which we featured recently on Freeways of Los Angeles, there was no ramp at Barranca, nor was there an overcrossing. So when the freeway was being built in that area, West Covina had one of the largest population explosions in the country around 1956, 1957. And in response to that, Caltrans, or Division of Highways back then, added an interchange and overcrossing at Barranca that was designed even while the Ramona Freeway was being constructed. So after it opened, maybe 9 months later, the Barranca interchange opened as well. So traffic and population forecast is what drove a lot of the design in those early days, from what I have seen, from what I have gathered.
And then, so they determined the need for a freeway, and then how did they get from there to the turning of the shovels and building?
Well, once you have your traffic forecast, the engineers take over. We have our formulas and equations we use, and for example, we have now they're a little bit different than then. But if our planners and designers know that freeways could handle 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour, that type of demand before you reach full capacity, and then you get into levels of service. You're not going to have free flow all the time because of just excessive traffic. So how can you design a freeway so that it meets a certain level of service? That maybe acceptable level of service back then would have been if the freeways can move at least 30 miles an hour on average during rush hour. That would be an acceptable level of service. So let's design that to so the freeway capacity can handle that type of level of service. So again, it all goes back to traffic forecast and demands and how we can best find solutions to meet those demands.
Now, I heard, and I don't know whether it's an urban legend, that the process of understanding traffic flow is very similar to physics and fluid dynamics and turbulence of water when new flows are introduced. Is that true?
I've not heard that, but I could see some truisms in all that, because when we talk about a bottleneck on a freeway, it could be very similarly compared to a drainage or a water system where you have a bottleneck, where you have pressure building up because of you have a literal bottleneck. So I've not quite heard that urban legend, but I could see some similarities in the description, but it wasn't something you would hear around the office, at least when I was there. Nor haven't seen it documented, but there's some truth to it.
The Great Renumbering happened in 1964 in the midst of this boom. Did that impact construction at all? If you're familiar with that?
Not to my knowledge. No, it didn't. It's interesting because a lot of the old as-built plans that I've seen from the 50s and 60s, they don't even use the signed route number. It's all legislative route numbers that are on the plans. And so if the way they're being signed is changed as they did in 1964, that certainly didn't affect any of the design or construction. It was just a matter of what physical sign will be posted out there. So as far as I know, no, that did not affect the construction.
One of my treasured artifacts is a 1959, I want to say it's a Renee guide of Los Angeles, where was deaccessioned from District 7, and the traffic engineers drew in yellow and blue pencil the routes of the legislative, and they marked it with the legislative route numbers on top of the map, so you could see where they were planning things.
Yeah, that apparently is what was driving things. By the time I came around 1980, legislative route numbers were non-existent. I imagine after 1964, they pretty much went the way of the dodo bird.
Now, what was or what is involved in renumbering a highway? Do you have any idea of what the cost of that renumbering was in terms of, for some routes, I would imagine it was minimal and all you were doing was changing green signs to white signs and the post miles didn't change. For other routes, I would imagine it would have been a much bigger change with lots of post miles and stuff changing. Maybe the closest thing we might have as an example is when either Route 11 got renumbered to 110 or Route 7 got renumbered to the 710.
I believe the costs were minimal, and like I said, it didn't affect the designer construction, changing that as far as from what I observed or what I've read about. I meant to take a look at that article, the California Highways and Public Works 1964 article that shows these two maintenance workers putting up the new Route 1 sign near Point Magoo with replacing the 101 Alt sign. That issue gives you a lot of good breakdown on the cost. I believe it mentions the cost there, and I don't recall what they were, but it seemed like it was mainly maintenance costs. And it's interesting that a lot of the period maps, even from 1961, were already posting the interstate shields on their maps alongside with the old U.S. route numbers that were done away with in 64. So, in fact, if you look at some of the early 1960 photos of Route 5 in San Clemente area, Camino Capistrano, that area, you see where they're co-signed with the Interstate 5 shield as well as the Route 101 shield. So there was an overlap on not only in the maps but also out in the field. But I really couldn't tell you the cost. I'm sorry, I didn't look that up.
We'll put a link to that edition of the magazine in the show notes. And I was going to say, we know they were signing the interstates. There's the well-known pictures of I-5W being signed in Oakland at that time before they came up with the I-580. And we talked already in this episode about how the U.S. highway signage kept being up there until they completed a particular route. So, for example, US 40 was still being signed until they completed I-80 in the Bay Area, and I think the same is true for the U.S. signage on I-10.
There was quite a bit of 6 and 99 on I-5 north of downtown Los Angeles up towards Weldon Canyon. If I remember correctly, a lot of that stuff used to just have green cover plates once those U.S. routes were truncated.
Yep. If that's the cheapest way to do it, state of California will find the cheapest way. Not the most aesthetically pleasing, but gets the job done.
Hey, that's why there are still signs on the 170 that we know date back to the 50s because they still have the white sign.
Oh, yes. And then you have the worst ones of all is the signs on the Foothill Freeway just west of where the 210-134 split takes place. Now, those are just, in terms of patchwork, those signs are really grotesque. And
are you referring to the stub signs for where the 710 was?
Yes. Well, were the signs that would take you to southbound 710.
I think we went to the Pasadena Playhouse a couple of weekends ago, and I think they finally replaced those.
Yes, I had heard that was in the works. Yes.
You still have some ugly signs on the 60 near where it approaches the 15 from the old days when it was Milliken Avenue and 31.
Yeah, they finally got rid of the US 60 cover plate shield near Banning, where 10 or splits off from 10.
Is that the one where the top of the sign, the top of the old shield still stuck out?
Yeah, where the US 60 shield was poking through. Yeah, that one's gone now.
Oh, that's a shame. That was
I got a lot of photos. Yes, I got a lot of photos of that right before they took it down.
Oh, good.
How much do you know about the Freeway Revolts and their impacts and how they got started?
Well, I'm very familiar with Route 710 revolt because I was involved in basically from 1985 to 2005. I was involved in every public hearing because they found out that I was fluent in Spanish, and at a public information meeting for the 710, this was the proposed work through South Pasadena. I took my father, because I grew up in El Sereno, right by where the freeway was going to go, and he had an interest in the 710 extension, and I took him to a public info meeting, and I was translating for him what was going on, all the pictures, all the displays, and one of the managers for Caltrans at that time saw me there and saw me in the office the next day, and he realized that I worked at Caltrans, and he recruited me to be the translator-interpreter at all the public meetings. So I'm very well acquainted with how the public responded when I went with Doug Failing, back then the district director, to do presentations in El Sereno, and I introduced myself as an El Sereno, a former resident and graduate of Wilson High School in El Sereno. I was practically stoned as a traitor, so it was interesting.
Let me see whether you agree with my theory.
Okay.
And I've told this to some folks, which is the real problem with the 710 is that Caltrans shot themselves in the foot. And the reason I say that is when they built the 210, they decided to build that interchange, which fixed the northern end of the 710 where it was going to be, where the 210 and the 134 come together. If they hadn't built that interchange there, they would have had much more flexibility on picking a route for the 710 that might have worked better. But they sort of were stuck because they built the interchange there, and now they had to figure out how to use it. And that dictated all of the mishigas that came later from where they had that in. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I would disagree, because if you look at the 710 or the Long Beach Freeway when it was built north of Route 5, the Santa Ana Freeway, this is through East LA and going north, it pretty much had a north-south orientation. And if it would be natural just to continue that to the north, the same alignment. It doesn't have a lot of breaks and curves, even when it goes past the 10 freeway. And all that was done in the early 1960s, whereas the interchange there at the 210-134 break, that was designed like 1970. So that came much later. So I believe that interchange location was based there, or decided at that location, because that would follow the natural progression of a north-south Route 710 or Long Beach Freeway Route 7 back then. So I believe that made sense to the engineers and planners that would be the natural place to put it. So I don't, just from my thoughts and what I remember reading about or seeing in the planning, the southern end is what drove the direction of the alignment to the north, I believe.
Do you think the 710 was, or at least that gap closure, was doomed from the start?
I don't think so. I actually had hope that it would get built or designed before I retired. And based on when I was living in El Sereno, right by where the freeway would go at Huntington Drive, the community there was all supportive. We wanted there to be a freeway there. We were tired of driving through local streets, Fremont Avenue, to get down to the 710 and the 10 freeway in Alhambra off of Valley Boulevard. So we were hoping that we would have closer access to a freeway, so the 710 would have filled that need. So there was generally a lot of support in that area. So when years later, when I went back with Caltrans to present some of the alternatives, there was a lot of hostility and opposition, but I didn't believe that reflected all of the residents. It was more of the political activists that were just outspoken, and in the end, they won out. So I don't believe it was doomed from the beginning. I believe there was some hope that it was going to get built. There was some expectation that it would get designed and built. But
if we were to look at the successful revolts versus the unsuccessful revolts, we had successful revolts in Beverly Hills. We had successful revolts in many ways from South Pasadena and Pasadena on the 710, which had the whole, we're pushing things like the meridian alignment and so on. And then we had unsuccessful revolts. I know Boyle Heights was not happy with having 3 freeways going through it. I have a friend who does a lot of Jewish history tours in Boyle Heights, and he talks about the impacts of the freeways in the area and how the people there really couldn't protest. And I don't know whether there were similar revolts as they were planning the route of Route 11 at that time, US 6, through South Central. How much do you think that's true?
There were almost virtually every freeway had its protests. I recently posted some photos, maybe in the last 5-6 weeks, photos of a protest at LA City Hall at a council meeting for against the Harbor Freeway construction. This was early 1950s. So there was a lot of, there was some protesting going on, but if you're wondering why they were not effective, why they didn't work out, the freeway was built in spite of those protests. I couldn't tell you all the reasons why. As far as East LA, one thing I could speak to is, I believe that once the freeways got built, the residents just settled in and accepted it. I'm sure there was a lot of unhappy people, especially those displaced. But having I have a lot of family in East LA, Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, East LA, the East Side, and they knew I worked for Caltrans, and never did I get attacked or criticized for working for an agency that destroyed the East Side, LA East Side. So I believe that in later years, maybe 15, 20 years after the fact, that the animosity settled down. Just similarly to Chavez Ravine and Dodger Stadium, there's still some people that won't forget. We'll go to a Dodger game because of what happened, and but some like me will go to Dodger games in spite of what happened in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So I believe a lot of people just go about accepting it and moving on with their lives in spite of any injustices that were done earlier.
I tend to look at these things in many ways as a historian, try and look at it with a neutral eye and understand and see how things have changed. So if we look back with what we know now, how do you think our modern sensibilities will change how highways are routed versus what we did in the past?
I definitely believe that today's social justice, activism, just more consideration to the environment and to how people's lives are affected. Today, that environment, these thoughts do affect how things are done in the way the state designs. I know that, for example, Route 710, this is one of the projects I worked on before I retired. There was a master plan to greatly widen and improve Route 710, the whole 20 miles. And that project got shelved last year. And this was a project that had a lot of planning, a lot of work done. It was 20 years in the future, but because of today's sensitivities, it got shelved because they didn't believe they couldn't get it done. They didn't have the support. If they don't have support, political support, they won't get the funding. So it was basically seen upon as a dead end in today's environment. So definitely today's political, social justice environment, and some of these things are good. It's good that these things are there because I believe the state in the past they stomped on the rights of some people and then they moved on, and then people just moved on as well. But it didn't mean that it was right to begin with. So now the pendulum's kind of swung the other way, and it might end up going back somewhere towards the middle in the future. But in the near future, I believe that today's freeway and highway design work or proposals are definitely being affected by what we see today in our society, in our country, in our politics.
In our next episode, we're going to be talking about one of the sea changes in California transportation planning being the movement from a state-driven determination of highways to one that has much more involvement of the regional transportation planning agencies. So, we moved from the era where Caltrans would decide where the highways were going to what we have now where, like in District 7, the real boss is LA Metro deciding things, and they basically dictate things to Caltrans, and that does create problems where you have to have multiple districts working together, like, say, District, Metro and the RCTC for Riverside, or the OCTA for Orange County.
TC and so on.
Yep.
And, that's been like that for many years now. I'm aware of that.
What would you say the impact of that has been? Can you sense that in how freeways are planned and built from the early 60s to now? And what has that done?
What I the most is there's more politics involved. These regional agencies, they're more driven by politics because who was it that coined the expression politics is local? It definitely applies to the transportation planning agencies like the Metro and VCTC and the Orange County OCTA, I believe. So there's a lot more politics involved, but at the same time, there's the local folks, the people, even and the politicians have more of a say. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it does slow things up in a sense because there's more squabbling, and that reaching a consensus, I believe, is more difficult because the more people you have chiming in, I think the longer it'll take to reach a consensus. Not necessarily a bad thing, just the reality of the matter.
Do you think there are going to be any more big freeway projects in Southern California?
No, not anytime soon. Maybe in 40 years, perhaps. And maybe what we'll see are elevated transit ways, like what we wanted to incorporate into the Route 405 Sepulveda widening, but we were not able to do that because the people of the community didn't like the visual of having an elevated transit way running through their community. And we had plans to include things like that. So things like that have a lot of obstacles. Good solutions that are good for our environment, good for promoting more people using public transportation and getting away from the vehicles. But that's not going to be so easy to change people's habits and mind and heart.
Tom, I've been asking a lot of the questions here. Do you have some questions you'd like to ask?
So circling back to the 710 stub interchange, what shields were underneath those cover plates? Were they Interstate 710 or were they California State Route spades? Do you have any idea?
No, I've wondered that myself. I've been searching the web and I've not seen anything at Caltrans that says that. Although as we're talking right now, I'm thinking there's probably a lot of the answer would probably be found in some of the as-builts of the Foothill Freeway when it replaced the Colorado Freeway in 1972. So some of the as-builts there may very well show you what's below, because I have as-builts of when the Long Beach Freeway was changed from the 7 Shields to the Route 710, and it showed where the new Shields overlays were, where they were covering up the old Route 7. So perhaps the as-builts for the Foothill Freeway might show you the same. I haven't looked there yet, but as we're talking, a light bulb went on in my mind.
Yeah, that would be something I'd be curious to see, because the actual definition of Interstate 710 actually ends in I-10, even though the signage continued all the way up to Valley Boulevard.
Yep, and my understanding that southern stub of that 4-level or 5-level at 134 210 did have some Route 7 shields there.
There were certainly some post miles that were.
Yeah, they're still there. They're 710, but yeah, there are a lot of post miles on that stub, but it doesn't tell you if it's state or interstate because the designation is the same.
I know you talked about getting into discussion on post miles down the line. You're going to find they haven't changed since the 1960s. That's for sure. I have 1960s maps that show the post miles, and I compared them a couple of years ago with current post mile maps, and the numbers are still the same. Unless the freeway's been extended and you added more mileage to it, but
if I recall correctly, they actually reset with the 1964 renumbering.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was actually having a conversation with one of the Tahoe region people today. He was asking me why Interstate 80 near Donner Pass has our post miles, and it's because I believe that segment over Donner Pass actually technically opened in November 1964, which would have been right past when the renumbering was effective. So basically, to kind of get into a summary about post miles, anybody listening, our post mile designates a initial rerouting of a route. So it was already post mile Route 80 at that point by the time the renumbering took place. What about the Malibu Canyon Freeway? How far did that actually get along? I know there was never really an adopted route for that.
This would be the Route 64 freeway.
Correct.
And I would think that there's a similar question for the Route 14 freeway through the San Fernando Valley, which would have ended actually near where I went to high school at Sunset and Temescal.
The Malibu Canyon Freeway, that I don't think went very far. It was, I believe the city of Malibu basically shot it down. I never saw serious planning for that. I never saw any documentation other than just a few city council displays and exhibits. So I don't think that was seriously considered. I mean, there was some far-fetched designs to build a causeway off of Santa Monica to an island and then back to the northwest of Santa Monica. But those were just, I believe, just pipe dreams. I don't think they went very far. They were not seriously considered.
Yeah, there's a pretty famous drawing which shows what you're talking about, the causeway on the little man-made islands and the interchange with the Pacific Coast Freeway. It's quite something to look at least in the concept drawing, that's for sure.
Mike Ballard used to note that at the interchange where the 5 and the 14 come together, there was some extra concrete at one point, it's gone away, where they were starting to build the stub for the eventual Route 14 continuing south into the valley. How much do you know about that whole plan to build a route effectively down Reseda and across the hills?
I admit I don't know too much about it, but I have not seen anything in the construction photos of that area, and I've seen quite a few that indicated that they were going to extend it, or they actually poured some concrete for that. That I've not seen, so I couldn't speak to that, but I'd be surprised to find anything like that in the photos that I've looked at and studied. But I just don't know enough about it to really say for sure.
So building on that, what stories might you be able to tell us? What can you tell us? What stories do you have about unbuilt freeways in Southern California?
The Beverly Hills Freeway, I worked with some of the engineers that worked on the proposed design in the 1960s. And the stories they would tell me were that that's when the state of California, Division of Highways back then, of course, first realized that they couldn't get their way through everything. There was a lot of powerful political influence in Beverly Hills. The displacement of businesses, of wealthy campaign contributors would be affected. So that's when I was first informed or educated about how, at that point in time, when the Beverly Hills Freeway was halted, that the state realized that that Superman's cape had a tear in it. They could do whatever they wanted, and that started to change the mentality of the engineers that not everything they designed was going to get built. And sure enough, there was several projects that were scrapped. That's basically the only story I know. The other freeways that were not built, I was not too privy to those, nor did I hear much discussion about that with the older guard that was there when I started in 1980.
The Yorba Linda Freeway, I know that really never got built to scale, and it was kind of redundant when the Century Freeway got built.
Right. That's Route 90 you're talking about, right?
Yeah, it was. 90. Yes, Route 90, and I forget what it was. I think it was 42 originally. That just never went anywhere. Was there any kind of advanced planning that went into that? I believe there was some route adoptions that actually got rescinded with that one.
During my years with the state, I never heard much of anything with that freeway. It was, if anything, the Century Freeway 105 was the talk of the town during my early years. So these other freeways that didn't get built like that one, didn't hear too much about it. Not too much scuttlebutt about that.
Was there any talking about the Laurel Canyon Freeway? Basically, when Tom talked about this stuff, it made me think about the expressway portion of Route 90, which then made me think about the old L.A. County-built expressway portion of La Cienega, which was originally intended to be part of the 170.
Was that L.A. County or L.A. City?
I think that particular area around Stocker is L.A. County. It is not part of the city. It's over near the Baldwin Hills Dam. I grew up in the area, Ladera Heights.
Okay.
And I think that's L.A. County.
Yeah, I didn't hear much talk about that other than it was just a glorified expressway. And back then, my curiosity wasn't piqued about why wasn't that developed. I mean, parts of it are a freeway, are freeway-like, but not all of it, of course. And but I wish I would have looked more into that and spoken to some of the engineers that knew about that and were involved in that. Of course, that was the state of California that did the design work on that, but I know that we would have had some oversight or consultations with them because, I mean, if you go back to the early days of freeways, within the city of LA, the City of LA Engineering, Bureau of Engineering did the freeway design, like for Arroyo Seco, and the state of California did freeway designs for the outlying areas outside of city limits. So I know that there was some division like that before, but when the La Cienega Freeway was proposed and started to get built, it was a little bit murkier then how the division was made between who's doing the design work and construction. But I don't remember Caltrans being involved with that.
So one that's always kind of been curious to me, since the freeways have been built, there's largely been kind of a shift towards shedding urban surface mileage. But one that kind of seems to buck the trend is Route 213 on Western Avenue. Is there anything unique about that route that kind of is making Caltrans in the is there anything unique about that route that is really making that important to hang on to compared to the other ones?
Not that I know, and I am surprised that it hasn't been relinquished, because I know these former state highways, they're older, whether it's Whittier Boulevard or even an Olympic Boulevard. I mean, as they aged and required more maintenance, the state was glad to rid themselves of maintenance headaches on some of these routes. So Western Avenue, that one is a good question. I don't know why the state has hung on to that one. Probably the reason is political, but I don't know. I don't know for sure. But I would speculate it would be political.
Are there any other things you think we should know about? Any other interesting stories you would like to share with us?
Well, my most interesting stories are about my involvement with the Long Beach Freeway, the proposed Long Beach Freeway extension, the public information meetings I went to, the arguments I had to break up between elderly gentlemen that were documented in some in a newspaper back then. My involvement with the in Orange County on the 555 interchange. I shared one story earlier about them wanting to they would me to design the freeway so it goes through their property. I got a lot of stories like that. Time fails me right now, but there's these are things that I plan to write down and document in some type of book format sometime in the.
And I'll say that knowing Arturo, if folks want to see some of these stories, the best place to find them is the Freeways of Los Angeles group on Facebook.
Well, I'm saving some good stories for a future book that I've been hoping to put out, but it's been delayed and postponed. So I'm saving some of that stuff for a prospective book. So stay tuned. That's all I'll say.
We'll look forward to that. I'd like to thank you for your time on this, and maybe we'll get you back on a future interview where you think it's appropriate.
Well, it's finally great getting face-to-face with you after being in your group for so long. Definitely appreciate what you do on your Facebook page.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to meet you folks. The closest we have in person, but just having this discussion is good. I look forward to having some more in the future.
Well, thank you again for your time.
For having me, Daniel and Tom, and best wishes to you all.
We thank Arturo for joining us for a really interesting interview. And now, let's return to the subject of this episode.
During 1968, a freeway revolt happened in San Francisco, changing and reworking a number of the Bay Area routes. Additional interstate definitions released and tweaked. This resulted in a large number of changes. Almost all the San Francisco routes had changes. This created the creation of current Interstate 105, extension of Interstate 605, and the renumbering in downtown Los Angeles.
Do you want to try and summarize some of what happened in San Francisco?
Oh, man, it is quite the story. So basically, San Francisco was planned to have interstates basically going throughout the entire city. So, for example, Interstate 280 was planned to follow 19th all the way through the Presidio to the Golden Gate Bridge. You had Interstate 480, which was planned to follow the Embarcadero Freeway, which did get built, and the Golden Gate Freeway, and you had all sorts of like very unique routings like California State Route 87, which the northern part of its route got eventually changed to Interstate 280. There was also extension of I-80 west of US 101, which I believe, if I recall correctly, was going to end at Interstate 280 originally. So basically, you could take a map of San Francisco and you could add a whole bunch of freeways into it, or at least that's what the original idea was.
And when you see a map like that, you can begin to understand why all of those established communities started to get upset. Now, 1968 saw one other thing. The election of Ronald Reagan as governor. And now here's where I'm going to plug one of my favorite books. It's called The Late Great Days of the State of California by Kurt Gentry. And it is a little bit science fiction because it has California being destroyed by an earthquake at the end. But what it really is a deep analysis of the 1968 election of Ronald Reagan, the battle against Pat Brown, and the involvement of folks like Sam Yorty in the campaign. And it really was the start of a lot of our modern political system. So it's well worth reading. It's a really good read if you can find it. Now, Ronald Reagan was a fiscal conservative. He raised taxes and he did selective cuts to the non-transportation areas to balance the budget. He did not continue Brown's trend of increasing infrastructure spending, and he signed the Environmental Quality Act. We tend to think of Republicans as being against the environmental issues, but Reagan signed the Environmental Quality Act, and Nixon was the one who created the EPA. So what was that?
There's also a lot of environmental stuff aside from freeways and roads that Reagan was involved with. A lot of the wilderness areas you see designated in national forests in California came about during Reagan's administration as governor.
Now, there were increasing financial problems. As I said, Reagan did not cut the budget for highways. It stayed the same. Costs, however, didn't. Land value was increasing as more folks moved to California. This increased right-of-way costs. There were the increased costs of dealing with community opposition. There were the increased costs of dealing with environmental issues. There was increased construction and labor costs. And there was an increased scope and capacity of projects. So during the 1960s, although the budget was flat, the development costs in California increased at an average rate of 8.2% each year, which was 3.5 times the average annual inflation rate of 2.4%. So in the 1970s, state highway construction expenditures in California rose from $4.1 million per mile in 1970 to $16.7 million per mile in 1980, which was an increase of 12.1%. Well ahead of the inflation rate of 8.7%. So things were getting more expensive, but you weren't getting more money. That really slows down construction.
During 1969, there was the passage of several key important pieces of legislation. The passage of the Federal Environmental Quality Act, the passage of the California Environmental Quality Act. This led to significant changes how freeways were planned and constructed. So I think in the road community, there's a misunderstanding about what these laws mean. So before 1970, when these laws really took effect, you didn't have to really get a lot of environmental clearance and review for projects. Now you do. In the post-1970 world, you do. And if anyone, and I imagine quite a few listeners have read environmental impact statements, they're lengthy. It's very easy to challenge things in them in court, which will hold up projects and bog them down if you're not done properly.
And it should be noted that environmental quality is more than just, I'm protecting this endangered animal. It also looked at the quality and the impact of the freeway on people living in the area. And were they getting more exposure to pollutants? Was their traffic being made worse or better? This was all part of the Environmental Quality Act that had to be analyzed.
In terms of routes, 1969 saw the creation of Interstate 380 and saw major changes to the routing of Interstate 15 and US 395 and the establishment of the Business and Transportation Agency.
And this is a good place to stop. There's about one more segment of the chronology we'll cover in the next episode, and that segment will cover the impacts of these Environmental Quality Acts. We'll see also the growth of non-chargeable interstates. And we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about interstate numbering. But essentially, a certain number of miles were authorized. These are the ones that got the 90% federal funding. There were also non-chargeable interstates that didn't count against those miles and were signed as interstates. Those we'll talk about in the next episode. There was also a significant slowdown on the definition of new highways in the state. The bulk of the highways we have in the state are what were defined in the 60s to this day. There were significant changes in the highway planning and funding processes, and there was increasing relinquishment of highways to cities because cities no longer wanted to deal with the state if they wanted to try and improve the route through their cities.
For more information, visit the Chronology section over on cahighways.org. Most of the Gribble Nation blogs in California touch upon the early days, including the development of the U.S. route system. Links to relevant information on the show page at caroutebyroute.org. Details for specific routes on the specific route pages on cahighways.org and gribblenation.org.
As always, information on this episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can also leave us comments on the episode. The episode is also available on our Anchor FM home, anchor.fm/caroutebyroute. It's also available on most of the podcasting applications, and we also encourage you to go and look at our back catalog to catch the episodes you've missed. We invite you to join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route. This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fearer, edited and produced by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is "I'd Like to Be by the Seaside" by John H. Glover Kind. If you have an opening theme that you think might be good for our show and is either in the public domain or you're willing to let us use, contact me at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. Episodes are recorded using freeconferencecall.com. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblenation.org. Is there anything you'd like to add to this, Tom, that you think is significant about this period of highway construction?
This is basically where you see the full emergence of the modern highway system in California. I'm looking forward to the next couple episodes because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding just kind of in the common sphere of the road world on kind of what the chargeable interstate system really entailed versus the non-chargeable. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that.
That will be covered in detail in our interstate numbering episode, which I guess at this point, now that I've written it, should be retitled as All Things Interstate, because we cover all sorts of things on the interstate highway system in addition to numbering. For me, this period is just one where it's certainly the period where I grew up, the early 60s, and I remember all the interstates and the freeways being built. And I think it's what shaped my love of the highways, just seeing these roads come into existence as major interstates, which is especially true living in Southern California. Anything else, Tom?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. You always sort of end with that, I think we're good.